We can actually accept our messiness, and we can also learn to then manage our messiness, which is recognition, okay, that was messy, it's okay to be messy, but I can't stay in that because it's having a consequence.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today we welcome Caroline Leaf to the show. Dr. Leaf is a communication pathologist and cognitive neuroscientist. Since the early 1980s, she has researched the mind-brain connection, the nature of mental health, and the formation of memory. Dr. Leaf is also the best-selling author of Switch on Your Brain, Think, Learn, Succeed, and Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. Her latest book is called How to Help Your Child Clean Up Their Mental Mess. In this episode, I talked to Dr. Caroline Leaf about managing the mind. The world is a crazy place, and our minds can get disorderly trying to keep up with it. But according to Dr. Leaf, to have a messy mind is to be human. We don't have to pathologize our emotions and thoughts. Instead, we can embrace them and implement strategies that allow us to better direct ourselves. Dr. Leaf shows us how to make sense of the messy mind and the scientific research behind those steps. We also touch on the topics of self-compassion, consciousness, trauma, and neuroplasticity. It's always fun chatting with Caroline. I was on her show a little while back, and I've been looking forward to having her on my show for a while. So I'm glad to get this out there, and I think she's going to really help you clean up your mental mess and get order in your life and make some sense of your life. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Caroline Leaf. Dr. Leaf, it is so exciting to have you on the Psychology Podcast.
Oh, it's so good to be with you again. I so enjoyed interviewing you before. We laughed a lot. I just remember us having a lot of laughter and a lot of great discussions. So it's an honor.
I remember laughing a lot with you too. Didn't you have like a classroom? You were in a classroom sort of background?
Probably a different set on my studio, because I'm in the same studio, but I think I had a different, because we have different sets in here. So I think it was my green screen. Yeah, I had a green screener. Yeah, I think that's what it was.
Well, can you introduce yourself a little bit to our audience first before we get into your work?
Absolutely. Well, I've been in the field of mind-brain-body research for 38 years now, so it like dates me. I started in the 80s. That's when I did my degree in communication pathology and cognitive neuroscience, and it was an interesting degree because they don't actually have it anymore. They mixed up. Neuroscience was very new then, so what they had was they put us into a combination of medicine, and I say this which will make sense with my background. They did mixed up medicine, psychology, communication pathology, neurology. So we had all this incredible, and neuroscience in its infancy, we had this incredible degree with all this clinical application. We worked 7 days a week. They nearly wiped us all out, and only 60 of us actually qualified before they decided they needed to split up the degree into 2 years, into two separate degrees, because they put 7 years in 4. But I say to you, I'm so glad I did it. I hated it I loved and hated it at the time. But Barry, what it taught me to do was to think very critically. It taught me to see things from a different angle, from a medical perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a neuroscientific perspective, from a communication pathology perspective. And essentially what I was trained to do was to look at how people show up and to try and help understand what experiences in life have resulted in that, and how is that impacting the physical functioning of the brain and the body. So it was a unique angle that didn't get me stuck in a field, and it launched me into doing a lot of research, which one of my neurology professors one day really triggered that by making a comment that, hey, listen, the brain is fixed. This was in the 80s. Thank goodness we don't think that anymore. And if someone has brain damage, you just have to teach your patients to compensate, and proceeded to give us a whole lecture about that. And I remember raising my hand and saying, but that doesn't sound realistic, because as humans, we're constantly changing. We're having multiple experiences. We're different all the time. So there must be something more to this. And he actually said, well, that's a ridiculous question. I'll never forget that. I actually did a TEDx talk called The Ridiculous Question of Neuroplasticity. And at that time, there wasn't even a word really around that. It was such a new concept. And I said, okay, well, he said, go do research. I said, well, give me the area that you think is the most challenging. And so he threw out, we could see it was dismissal. It was, okay, go and research traumatic brain injury, because it's a waste of time. There was so little research on TBI in the 80s. So I thought, okay, well, I'm young, innocent, don't know much yet. And then you go do it. So I just dived in and started researching TBI and looking for systems of how could I help someone with traumatic brain injury improve cognitive, social, emotional functioning. And that launched me into where I am now, where I did intensive research in that area, worked with people with all different kinds of emotional constraints, severe trauma, traumatic brain injury, neurological impairment, stroke, what we call ADHD, but more learning disabilities, because that terminology of ADHD is always questionable. So all the neurological plus the trauma side, and I was in South Africa at the time, so I did a lot of my work in the pre-apartheid transition and post-apartheid era. Worked in schools with people. I went almost what I call underground for almost 25 years, where I wanted to understand the human experience from a multicultural perspective and from all different angles. So I was working in very poverty-stricken areas as well as working with people that were CEOs of companies. My objective was really to understand mind-brain connection and how people function. And then I basically practiced for 25 years and now for the last 5 years, we are doing a lot of formal research, myself and my team, and busy with publications and research studies and whatever in this field, sort of all coming together. And I write books and I teach this stuff in my podcasts and at conferences. So there's a quick overview.
You are busy. You are a busy human. How do you have any time for research with your Instagram posts?
That's true. The research comes out of and 4 kids. I have 4 kids too. So in the process, they're my guinea pigs. I always say that they're my lab rats, which they think is hilarious. But 3 of them work for me. And my fourth, which is my son, is actually co-authoring children's books with me at the moment. So all 4 kids are involved in some way, all adults, which is lovely.
That's incredible. They're very interested in psychology and neuroscience.
They love the whole mind, brain, psychology. I mean, Dominique, who you met earlier on, who's my producer, she was actually in Hollywood and working with actors and things. And so she moved over to this field, and she loves it. They all love it. They've all found they boss me around and tell me what to do.
You're so popular. I mean, your work resonates so much with people. And you have this very unique combination of nerdy neuroscience information and knowledge with personality. You're funny, you're charming, So what do you think in your own eyes resonates the most with people that are watching your lectures on Instagram, for instance?
I think, Scott, what really resonates is the fact that I say to people that it's okay to be a mess. And, you're not diseased if you have an emotion. Emotions are not illnesses, and it's okay. And there's hope. So I try and infuse everything with a message of hope, because I've worked with such extreme cases. And you just have to go back to the pre-apartheid era in South Africa. And I worked there 3 days a week and saw the most absolutely shocking things. And in Rwanda over the genocide and just post-genocide and that kind of thing. When you've seen that level of pain in humanity and you see people coming through, I know that there's hope for humanity, and the whole thing of mental health is such a human experience that I think that's maybe what appeals to people, is understanding that mental health is part of our human experience. It's okay to be a mess, and there's a way of managing the mess that can help us find a level of peace and embrace all of our humanity, including the bad stuff, not to be scared of the bad stuff, but to see it for the message it can bring.
Yeah, I mean, you're known for this idea of the mental mess. I think it really relates to I call creative people as having, I say they have messy minds, and I say it in a positive way. So in the spirit of discussion, can we say that sometimes it's not necessary to clean up the mental mess? Sometimes it's actually good to just embrace it and accept the messiness of it for creativity.
Oh, absolutely. That's, I think, one of the three words that I say a lot, and that's to embrace and process and reconceptualize. But who knows how long each phase lasts? It's so unique. As we by individual, we are so unique in the way that we go through things. And I think that's been such a big problem with mental health, is that there's these very limited sort of diagnostic categories that aren't even accurate scientifically. And kind of you've got to fit in this mold, in this cookie cutter mold. And if you're not, if you're still experiencing grief after losing a loved one after X amount of time, suddenly you've got a disease. Meanwhile, that is such a unique experience for that person. No one's an expert on your experience, only you are. And even we trying to get to grips with what that is. So yeah, I think messiness is a huge part of when we start embracing our messiness, we start embracing our humanity, and that's where we can start finding acceptance for things that we can't understand and find a level of peace.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many people just feel as though their mind is a mess, especially right now.
Exactly.
During this era we're living in right now. Can you unpack a little more what that means to have a mental mess, and what does it mean when you say sometimes we don't use our minds correctly? Well, what's like the incorrect way of using the mind? Can you explain this a little bit?
Absolutely. So I know there's a lot of almost controversy, if that's the right word, around what the mind is. And in fact, you and I both know from our training is that the mind is considered the hard question of science, or consciousness is considered the hard question of science. I come at this from another angle why I talk about the messiness of the mind being okay and what it actually means and all that stuff, is that I don't think that the mind is the hardest question of science at all. I think it's the most obvious question. The mere fact that you and I can have this conversation, that we both have a level of expertise in our fields, that we can converse around these topics, that's evidence of mind. Like I am not floating and you're not floating, that's evidence of gravity. We can't see gravity, but we can see the product of gravity, which is us not floating. So we may not be able to see mind, but we see it physically. And we can actually see it physically, because then I'll come to that. But we see the evidence. You and I having a conversation, being able to process, being able to answer each other's questions, being able to experience what we experienced before and what we're going to experiencing afterwards. That for me is evidence of mind. I'm thinking and feeling and choosing in response to your questions, and I'm formulating answers. That's all mind in action. So the mind is literally like a gravitational field, quantum energy, etc., by electromagnetic fields. There's so many ways we can understand the physics side of mind. But there's this very impactful side of mind, which is the sort of psychological side, which is our ability to think and feel and choose, which is what we're doing now in response to each other. But that thinking, feeling, choosing, which is all this energetic force, etc., is moving through the brain and the body. So the mind has to have the involvement of the brain and the body in order for you and I to show up in this conversation. If we were dead, there wouldn't be us, we wouldn't be having the conversation. There would be nothing happening in our brain and body. But the fact that we have a mind and we're alive, our mind is this energetic force that is driving the functioning of the brain and the body. So for example, you and I are both making, and all the viewers and listeners are making, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million cells every second. If you were dead, you couldn't do that. So there's some kind of energetic force that enables our bodies to run, our brains to run, to process these experiences of life into structural changes in our brain, into structural changes inside the cytoskeleton of our cell, which we feel in our experiences like trauma, we feel it in our body, memories are in our body as well, and some kind of relationship between this force of our mind, which I choose to call the mind, and spiritual level, whatever you want to call it, and this functioning of us as a human. There's something that there in our aliveness. And so mind is this driving force, this energetic force. And then I see mind also as having two parts to it. The messy part, which is so acceptable, like we've been saying. It's so much part of being human. We don't know what's coming up in the next moment. I mean, we can predict to a certain extent. I know you're interviewing me about my work, so I can predict with a 70% accuracy kind of the conversation where it's going. But I don't know what you're going to do after this. I'm going to have a very low understanding of what you're going to do after this. In other words, we live in a world you can't actually plan. So there's a lot of experimentation that we do as humans on a daily basis. And that's a messy process, and it's very normal. You don't know what someone's going to say to you or email to you or, throw at you. And we messy in the processing of life's experiences, and we messy in our responses. And that is okay, because that's how we learn. We make a mess, then we see, oh gosh, I shouldn't have got irritated, or I needed to plan better, or I needed to respond differently. It had an impact, or that wasn't the right decision. So we see the mess, and then we can repair, and then we can grow. So messiness has to happen in order for us to function. It's very scientific. The mind-brain-body connection is very systematic, very organized, very scientific. And in the scientific process, we're making all these little hypotheses, and then we've got to prove them or reject them or accept them. And that's what's happening very fast all the time, and that's what our mind is doing. So when I talk about managing the mind, which is a big part of kind of the philosophy and the way I approach the work, is that we can actually accept our messiness And we can also learn to then manage our messiness, which is recognition, okay, that was messy. It's okay to be messy, but I can't stay in that because it's having a consequence. It's maybe impacting my work relationship or my marriage or my relationship with a friend or my quality of my research or whatever. So I can say, okay, that's what's happened. Now I can stand back and I can manage that and I can change and reconceptualize. And that's a broad, big sort of Cliff Notes view. We can extrapolate that then to everything. So in terms of how we've dealt with COVID, how we're dealing with everything, anxiety, depression, all of that can be viewed in a state of, I can be messy. Life is hard. It's got good and bad. The toxic stuff, the experiences of life are processed by our mind into our brain and body. We are having an impact in our brain and our body. And that mind, brain, body impact needs to be, is going to express itself in how we show up. And how we show up may not be the healthiest. It may be a coping mechanism, but we can then go in and say, okay, well, that's what's happened. How can I change that? How can I rectify? How can I manage that? All the time, not pushing what's happened aside, because your story is your story. What's happened to you and is happening to you, you can never change, but you can change what it looks like inside of you and how it plays out into the future. So that's kind of what I mean by cleaning up the mental mess.
Thank you, Dr. Leaf. So yeah, this idea of mind management, that you talk about as kind of like, it's not mind control, it's mind management. And I think that's an important distinction, because I think a lot of people that have like a mental mess, they may go in the opposite direction and feel like they have to like gosh forbid we feel anything we don't want to feel, or gosh. And so what is management? Just unpack what it means to kind of be a manager of your mind.
Okay, very good question. So we in a biomedical dominant type of approach to mental health, where we've adopted the disease model of medicine and we've brought that over into, when I say we, not me, but it's it's very strong dominant sort of but dominating philosophy of mental health is one of a biomedical approach, which is seeing anything that goes wrong with us as a disease in terms of our mind. So like you have diabetes or cancer, and they can diagnose and they can track it to a biological cause, and they can give you a treatment that is as specific as they can get in medicine to that cause. That works with that kind of physical thing, but that model's been adopted into mental health, as you know, and that has then reduced, it's reductionistic, and it's taken us down to a level of where researchers have tried to say, if you feel depression, it's a disease. There are biological markers. So there's either genetic cause, or it shows up in your brain as a difference in your brain, or something with your chemicals. And as we know that chemical myth has once again been, in a recent paper by Joanna Moncrief, been shown not to be true. So based on that, mind management shifts away from a biomedical model, looks at you as a human, as a unique human having unique experiences. So this is not anything new. We all get that. But it's the narrative of your life and the narratives of your life that we have to actually honor. So if you have a traumatic childhood, the ACE studies, or if you have a traumatic marriage, or if you're going through something during COVID, which everyone's had different experiences, these are toxic experiences. So they are going to be processed by your mind. Your mind literally kind of grabs the process, puts it in your brain, builds it in as neural network changes, that sends an influence, a message to your body, and it's built into your body. So we have this mind-brain-body connection translating experiences into our brain, mind, brain, and body. So mind doing it, but it's also in the mind. It's in 3 places. So if we're having a toxic experience, that translates into, because it's going through the brain, it has an impact on the brain. So the brain and the body will then respond. It's a response versus it's not generating. So if let's say, for example, there is a very traumatic event that you went through in childhood, you suppressed it for years, and something recently has triggered that, because these experiences are volcanic in nature. You can suppress for only so long and then they will explode. And we get good at suppressing for various different. Sometimes it's just coping, it's a trauma response, whatever. But eventually it will, something maybe triggers it and it manifests itself. And it's so overwhelming that you go into a deep depression. So if you had to go and see a psychiatrist or potentially some psychologist, they would say, yes, questionnaire and use a DSM and something like that. And they'd give you a diagnosis and say you have clinical depression. And that's initially very nice to know, because now you have a reason for why you feel like you do, because it's so overwhelming, that feeling of depression. But it's kind of an empty gift. And it's like gift that seems to be something, but you open it up and now what? It doesn't actually tell you anything because it's not a true diagnosis. It doesn't link you back to a biomedical cause, a biological correlate, because they haven't ever discovered, after billions of dollars and euros and years and 50, 60 years of research, there have not been biological, genetic or chemical correlates. They've all been theories that have been constructs. So the DSM, or that's the word, clinical depression, is a construct. It's a description of an emotional, what I call an emotional warning signal. So let's say you have this thing from childhood, something triggers it now in the current state of your mind, or in your life, something's happened and you've got overwhelmed by this depression. I would say this in terms of my management: you don't have clinical depression because you can't have clinical depression. You're experiencing a very dominant emotion. Now, I want to put a proviso in there. I don't believe that you need to have a medical description of something like depression to make it valid. It is valid. In fact, I believe that actually stigmatizes and moves away from the true story and doesn't honor what you've gone through sufficiently. So mind management says, hey, I see you, I hear you, what you've gone through is significant and what you're experiencing is huge and it's knocking your life upside down. And that needs to be really dived into, and you need you need whatever level of support. But in addition to the support that we all need, there's also a level of internal mind management that is important. And that mind management will help you understand, to help you to a certain extent get to a level of understanding of the origin story of where this has come from, which is environmental. There's things that have gone on. There's the thing that happened as a child. So that's a nurturing maybe aspect, or a severe trauma. So there's things that went on. It could be racism. It could be some political situation. It could be, in other words, there's all the environment impacts us. It's not about us. It's about us in the world. And we have to consider the environment. So mind management is looking at you feeling extremely depressed and recognizing that that is a warning signal filled with messages that isn't alone, because if we feel depressed, it changes our behaviors. So there's a second warning signal, and that may be withdrawing, maybe can't get out of bed, maybe just can't talk at the moment, just can't sleep, whatever the behaviors are. That will also then trigger a physical response, because that experience wasn't just built into the mind, the gravitational fields and electromagnetic fields of the mind, but it was also physically as a structural change in the brain and a change in the body. So we then going to have this physical response, and that could be anything. I mean, we're all different. It could be that this is triggered, you suddenly discover that you get psoriasis, or you have tremendous gut ache, or there's suddenly whatever. There's so many physical impacts that have happened because of what you went through. And as this is triggered, it brings those back up. So that's the physical warning signal. So mind management is the honoring of, I feel depressed. I'm not depression. I feel depressed, extremely depressed because of. And there's a because of, and I'm going to embrace that depression to find that message behind it. And depression is not an illness. It's not a disease of the brain. It is a warning signal coming from what I call the unconscious, and we can dive into that maybe in the next question or something. It's coming from your mind-brain-body interaction. It's your best friend. It's on your side. It's coming through from the unconscious levels of the mind as an intrusive thought with all these signals. And if we embrace them, we then get a level of control over them, or a level of autonomy. That doesn't mean you're going to be walking around like an avatar all happy. It means that you could for months be in a state of tears and crying and not being able to get out of bed and not functioning. But that's still progress, because you are allowing yourself to embrace the grief. So I'll give you an example. I've got a case study in my latest book, this one over here. So there's a case study in here of a client in my recent clinical trial, which is a great example of this, who had experienced incredible childhood trauma, but so bad that the only way they could cope was suppression. So it was sort of the flight trauma response, and that was what they lived in. And, we can cope with those things. It's what you needed in the moment, whatever. But as a young adult, a millennial hitting their 30s, the volcano exploded in their life and everything was going wrong. They went for all the therapies, got all the diagnoses, and they were just getting progressively worse and wanted to just sort of leave the planet. So mind management, now how does this apply? So basically what this person wanted, what we needed was to understand the story. And initially when starting out, this person saw themselves as depression. Once we introduced a level of mind management, I didn't give them therapy. It's in an app. I put my systems into an app on the phone. So they literally once they had all the assessments and brain, QEEG, blood, narrative, psychological, very big matrix of assessment. They were then had the app loaded by my team because that was double blind, so they didn't meet me, into the app. Now, the point that I'm making is that I do believe in support. Absolutely. As humans, we need deep, meaningful connections, and whatever that looks like, we have to have it. But at the same time, you're not with your therapist, coach, or other people 24/7. You wake up with yourself. You're living with your own anxiety. You're in the shower with that trauma or that intrusive thought. So in other words, we need two things. We need mind management all the time because our mind never stops, and we need that support to help facilitate and collaborate. It's a collaborative process. So in this particular case, giving that particular person this ability to go and say, okay, this is what you do when these emotions come up. Let's look for the associated behaviors. Let's look for the way it's coming out in your body. Let's look at the perspective, which is the fourth one, because your emotions, your behaviors, and your physical sensations will channel by the nature of the mind-brain-body connection, will channel into our perspective. So it could be, and this is kind of what this person said, that extreme depression, not sleeping, not functioning well at work, just literally giving up, incredible issues with guts, etc., and life sucks. So there's a very simple example of that. It would be deeper. So in mind management, you would look at those signals, you would embrace them, and give yourself permission to feel those and experience those. And then basically once you've gathered awareness of those, you don't want to just be aware. If you just become aware and do nothing else, you'll get worse. So mind management involves preparing the brain, because it's very scary to look back at your past or to look at a trauma or something like that. So we need to know how to decompress, and that's breathing, all that stuff that we know about. That's so spoken about, very good for the neurophysiology. Then you go into this gather awareness, looking at those signals. Then you would move into a process of what does this actually mean? You would reflect. So it would be a why question. Why? More details. Why am I feeling this? What's going on here? Why? A little bit of why do I feel this emotion? Why is it linked to this? Then you would write that down, because your brain goes through stages. Then you would check what you've written down, and then you would actually end that little process with an action. Now, what I've just described is a concept that I developed called the Neurocycle, which is the tool of mind management, which is based on 38 years of research of how can I as a person direct the neuroplasticity of my brain. How can I get my messy mind under control, which implies I have a wise mind. I have a part of me that's not messy, that can kind of stand back, give myself permission to experience the messiness, and then try and make some sense of it and go through. And that's a process. What I showed with the research is that you can't just become aware. If you just become aware, you're going to increase levels of anxiety. If you've got to land the plane, and landing that plane is slowly over time, for just a limited amount of time each day, starting to unpack the intrusive thought that the signals were attached to, because that signal's attached to something. In the case of the case study I was explaining, they initially, obviously on day 1, they weren't sure what was going on. By days 4 to 7, they were starting to see, okay, there's something from childhood. By day 21, when they came back into the clinic for the next part of the next lot of testing and so on for the research, that person wasn't saying I am depression. That person was saying that I am depressed because of, and they said I'm even more depressed and I'm now anxious and extremely anxious. Now that immediately sounds, oh, they've gone backwards, because we've been trained to think, oh, I must suppress those thoughts. Those are bad things. Depression and anxiety are bad things. Those are illnesses. No, they're not. They are wonderful messengers, awful to experience, but if you embrace them, there's something behind them that's going to take you to the details of the thought that they're attached to. And that thought is the experience made of loads and loads of memories. Could be 1,000 different memories encapsulated into that thought, which is that intrusive thought that is making us feel that depression. So in mind management, what I do is I actually pay attention to the signals, track back to the intrusive thought, and then I go through a process over time, and the time is actually 63 day cycles. And in sort of first 21 is very deconstructing work and reconstructing, and then the second 42 is a stabilization in order to bring behavior in order for it to be able to apply in your life. And so at day 21, this particular subject who said, I'm even more depressed than before and more anxious, but there's growth because they're saying, I'm not depression. I am depressed because of. And I'm starting to see what. And that person started seeing the early childhood trauma. And they were grieving. So they were having an incredibly normal response to an adverse circumstance, which is terrible childhood trauma, abuse, terrible for years. So that's your ACE, adverse child experiences. But they had managed to suppress it for so many years with certain bursts in between, which they had numbed with medications and so on like that. But this is, they managed to, in a very day-to-day basis, slowly manage it through this very systematic process of driving the neural rewiring in a way that you can't fix this in a day. You'll overwhelm yourself and you'll fall apart. It's a teeny bit each day. And so by day 21, they were able to say things like, the depression and increased depression and anxiety is coming from the fact that I am now facing the issues and grieving. So they were in a period of grief.
Look, this idea of the neurocycle is fascinating, and your 5 steps that can help people. I would love to know more on a more personal level. I'd love to know how you have personally taken all these ideas to help yourself. You know, like, has there been a particular habit that you're willing to share with our audience that you've been able to apply these 5 steps to, and you've really, in 63 days have seen a lot of changes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So seeing it with patients is one thing, as you say, and thank you for giving me the leeway to give that overview, because now we can really unpack it. So in my own life, I could not live without this. So it started off with me helping my traumatic brain injury patients and then going with that whole history I told you. Then I started saying, hey, I'm using this while I'm working. I'm actually working with my patients and I'm experiencing change as I'm working with my patients. So from very early on, I started seeing things in my own life that I was battling with. I use this every single day. This is a lifestyle. I'm always working on a 63-day cycle where I'm working on a particular concept over a very structured time. But I also use it very quickly because the Neurocycle is not something that I've externalized and made very conscious, a very natural process that we as humans go through, actually at 400 billion actions and faster per second. So the non-conscious mind that's driving our functioning, this is quite a complicated thing of science, and I want to give you a whole lecture, but the simplified Cliff version notes is that the driving force of our non-conscious mind, N-O-N, not subconscious, not unconscious, the non-conscious, which is the most intelligent part of us that is experiencing life, that has all these thoughts with their memories collated and organized, and it's on your side, scanning and searching what's disruptive, what's enhancing. All of that is working and moving through the subconscious into the conscious mind and alerting us through those signals. Okay, so what I found when I was working with my patients is that, hey, these are intrusive thoughts and signals are coming to my own mind. And one of the things that I battled with for years that stole so much joy, and I can tell you a lot of different things, but this is very relatable to a lot of people when I've shared this before, is I used to say, if only, all the time. I couldn't enjoy a moment. Like I'd finish an interview and I'd think the whole time about what I should have said or could have said. Or I go on a holiday and I'm enjoying the holiday, but as the day ends, I'm thinking I could have done that, which would have made it better. I don't do it anymore. It's taken me multiple cycles of 63 days to not do that. Every now and then I get back into something will trigger and I'll fall back in the pattern, but through mind management, I can catch it because it steals my peace. And it stole my ability to enjoy my moment. Now, you met Dominique before we started. We were on a holiday back in South Africa when we still lived there. And we had this beautiful holiday house by the sea. And Dominique was about, I think, 7 or 8 years old. And we were leaving our holiday house to go back to our home. And I hated leaving holidays. I like everyone, but I'm really bad at leaving. I don't like holidays ending. And I was a whole way in the car for about 2 hours. I was going on about, I wish for this, I wish that, and if only this. I mean, I'm this adult with 4 kids and I'm saying these stupid things. And I was getting so anxious and so tense and so depressed about the situation that my little 8-year-old Dominique pipes up in the background, Mom, you are spoiling the holiday with your if-onlys. And it was the first time someone had actually took an 8-year-old, children are very insightful, to actually say, that was my intrusive thought. I was living in a world of if-only and losing the joy of the moment. And I decided right then and there, what I was doing with my patients was what I needed to apply for myself. And it did take me a couple of months for me to really understand how to navigate this, but it refined the process quickly as I applied it on myself. And so that has been, that's just one that set me free from everything. Because along with if only is could have, should have, would have, the ugly cousins, as my husband would call them, because it leads down, you just go down a rabbit hole of regrets and you lose the moment. So that was a big one in my life that set me free.
That's huge. No, thank you for that example. You talk in your book about lots of different domains in which this neurocycling can apply to. I think a big one right now is people trying to detox from their traumas. Any advice at all that you can offer people that maybe keep ruminating about an unpleasant experience they had or something like that?
Absolutely. Well, if you think of what an unpleasant experience is, that's going to come out into our consciousness, our awareness as an intrusive thought. So we've been told that intrusive thoughts are bad things. There's no bad emotion. There's no bad thing. Everything's basically just telling you something about what you're going through. So that's a key issue with trauma, is that whatever you are experiencing as an intrusive thought and all the signals that are attached are, yes, the experience may be very bad and traumatic, but the fact that you're experiencing it is, I know it sounds so hard to perceive it, but it is actually working for you and not against you when you know how to manage it. So if you're finding yourself ruminating, which is very much what an intrusive thought that's unmanageable make you do. You just go round and round in circles, like that if only, just go round and round in circles like a hamster wheel, and you just get worse and worse.
Intrusive rumination, yeah.
Intrusive and rumination. And what we see with neuroscience is that whatever you think about the most will grow. Essentially, whatever you think about the most grows. So neurologically, as you are thinking if only, or that intrusive thought comes up and you're getting caught up in the pain of that moment and you're ruminating over and over what that person said to you, or what that experience has done to your life, or how it's messed up, or how you feel, why did that person do that to you, and why did this happen to me? As you're giving it energy. Think of watering a plant and how a plant grows when you give it energy. Neural networks work the same way, and a neural network is pretty much is a thing that inside little protein structures called that make up branches called dendrites. That's where your thought it's growing. It's stored there. It's stored in your body and it's stored in your mind. So 3 places. So if I give it energy, it's getting bigger. And the bigger it gets unmanaged, the more we ruminate. So that's the one principle. The other principle is that I'd like to use, it's a continuum I developed with my patients years ago. And it's just helped me to explain this concept. Think of a continuum from 1 to 10. So 1 and 2 is just the ups and downs of life. They're just the joys and the little things that we can, the irritating email. Nothing that's too radical. It's just the kind of day-to-day stuff. Then we can move up to the sort of 3 to 5, where it's more of a struggle. It's a day-to-day. So it's not the end of the world. It's like maybe an irritating boss, or a child that's going through a difficult phase, or a project that you're working on that's really challenging you time-wise, or whatever. Something that is not unmanageable, but could become unmanageable. Then shift over to the sort of 6, 7s, where we're starting to tip now from healthy stress, which is what will happen in the first 2 levels, which is where your blood pressure increases, so you've got more oxygen and blood flow to your brain in a good sense, and therefore your decision making is more effective because your brain is going to work better, and your mind needs to work through your brain, so you want all the pathways clear, the fault clear, and all that stuff. That's good stress. We always think stress is bad, but where we start tipping is when we start feeling that those day-to-day struggles are accumulating and forming an aggregate, and it's starting to shift us from, I can't cope, this is too much. This rumination that was maybe intermittent is now happening almost 5 times an hour or 5 times a minute. I'm starting to feel like it's consuming all my time. Now I've shifted where instead of the blood vessels around my heart dilating and pushing more blood to my brain and activating my HPA axis, which is the stress axis, to work for me, now it's shifted into a toxic mode. So my physiology, my neurophysiology is now shifted, where one of a lot of things is that your blood vessels will now contract instead of dilate. So now there's not enough blood flow and oxygen to your brain, so now I've tipped into toxic stress, and now the HPA axis is working against me, cortisol rises and blah, blah, blah. A whole bunch of downstream effects start happening. So I'm feeling really bad. So my tip for someone who is experiencing trauma, when trauma is triggered, the last scale, part of the scale, you get the 8, 9, 10. Now those are those things that happened to us where we were the victim. So the big stuff, the huge things from childhood at any stage of your life that are a war, an abuse, a sexual encounter, loss of a loved one, car accidents, physical trauma to your body that's changed your life, those big, gigantic things that are very, very hard to process and take a lot of time to process, and very often we suppress for a time while we're learning to cope. So what I'm saying with the continuum is the first piece of advice is just try and rank, stand back, observe yourself. We're very able to do this. You could put 2 chairs next to each other. I used to do this when I was practicing. Put 2 chairs next to each other. You sit in one and you all sit in the other. The messy mind's in this one where you are, and then the wise mind's in the other one. And what you can do is almost shift chairs and say, okay, I'm going to step into my wise mind, and my wise mind enables me to stand back and give advice. If you want to know what that is and feels like, think of when someone comes to you, Scott, and they say, hey, I've got this problem. Can you help me? It's so easy to guide other people. It's so difficult to guide ourselves. So you want to do that. You want to get into that mode. It's the distancing concept in psychology where you stand back and you observe yourself and you give yourself advice. So it's almost like, okay, Caroline, how are you feeling? You're feeling like this. Tell me how you feel. What's coming out of you? How can I help you? And you shift between those 2 modes. And when you do that, you create a safe space where you can allow yourself to experience with no judgment, no guilt, no condemnation. This is what I am feeling in my emotions, in my body. This is what I'm doing in my behaviors, and this is my perspective. And you kind of itemize those. You gather awareness of those in this way, and in this very objective way, and then you start going through the rest of the neurocycle. So it's the continuum first. So I decided, okay, this is definitely a 7. This is in that 8, 9, 10 range. This is big stuff. Then you make a decision. Okay, well, we're not going to fix it today. We're going to move into a period of time. What support do you need? Do you need therapy? Do you need coaching? Do you need a friend? What sort of, that kind of thing. That's what I would recommend, that people really try and give themselves grace and peace and be kind to yourself. That brings in all those things. It's got like negative self-talk and creating self-boundaries and all that kind of thing.
Self-compassion.
Yeah.
Self-compassion.
Kind. We're not kind to ourselves.
Some narcissists are too kind to themselves.
That's also true, and that's another whole issue, because if you dig down deep, there's a lot of stuff going on there too. Aren't
people too kind to themselves? Some people. I'm being cheeky.
No, but you can be cheeky, because I think it's very relevant, because I think it's a coping mechanism. We can be so kind to ourselves, but it kind of hides on self-hate. So it's kind of like a surface thing. I'm just going to be happy. Got this under control.
Wow, yeah.
I'm great. And it's almost like a diversion, because the research, you would have seen the research showing that you can't be positive all the time. This happiness psychology movement's been pretty dangerous in a lot of aspects, is that it actually our functioning drops if you try to be like an avatar. If you try moderate excitement and happiness is very much more balanced and helps us to develop our characters and embrace suffering and all that kind of stuff and grow as humans.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So your neurocycling program, what I found perhaps most captivating to me as I was reading your book was the idea that you can use it for daily mind management. So it's sort of like a set of techniques and tools that you can use whatever arises in your life. You don't need to have a specific habit that you want to change in 63 days, but you can actually, it's sort of a way of being.
Absolutely. Yeah, you explained that really well. It's a system. It's a system of how you can get your messy mind talking to your wise mind, listening to the message from the non-conscious and driving neuroplasticity in the right direction. Neuroplasticity meaning the fact that the brain can change. It's changing all the time regardless. So the plastic paradox is that your brain's going to change regardless. If you don't direct the change, it's going to change in a direction that's not going to help you, affecting your body and feeding back into your mind. So the Neurocycle is a system birthed all those years ago and developed. And now, as I said, we have like 5 different trials running at the moment. We've got all kinds of papers we've prepared with like 5 papers and currently under preparation for publication, peer-reviewed journals, etc., showing the development of this concept. So it's a system within which you can put whatever you want. It's a framework. It's a vehicle. It is you can bring in, if there's certain techniques that work for you, meditation techniques, CBT techniques, ACT. I mean, there's a million different things. But you just want to put this in this framework that you can drive your direction in the way that you want it to drive. So yes, it's great for the big stuff, the big traumas, the 8, 9, 10s, even the 7, 6, 7s, 8s. That takes time to rewire. And the rewiring process works in cycles of 63 days and not necessarily one. I've had patients who've had to work over 2 years, which is 12 neurocycles over 2 years, before they felt, each neurocycle you'll feel more level of control, but before they feel like they've actually got to a point where they're starting to feel like they can, make positive strides in their life. So each is a positive stride, but it's accumulative. Day to day, it is amazing. I'll give you a simple example. My whole research team was meeting at my house for my studio home office situation for a big research meeting. And I had to go to the dentist in the morning, and the dentist, like normal, always runs late. And this was a really critical meeting, and nothing could start because I'm driving this process. So now I've got all these people all over waiting for me. They've arrived, and I'm sitting in the dentist chair. I can't get out of there. So I'm getting really anxious and edgy because I'm getting all these texts that I can hear ping, 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 and so on. So this is a silly example, but I neurocycled. I realized, okay, I gathered awareness. I calmed myself down of my emotions, what my body was doing. And just doing that calmed my neurophysiology down, gave me permission to feel this way. Then I reflected, which is, why am I feeling like this? Gave myself the answers. It was very calming. I couldn't write because the dentist's hand was in my mouth, but I visualized, okay, they're sitting there. I know that my husband will be entertaining them. My staff will be giving them drinks. So they'll be fine. And then I rechecked that saying, okay, we'll make up the time. And my active reach, which is the 5th step, is an action. I'm going to calm down, let the dentist finish, and tell the dentist to hurry up and get back. And when I'm there, we can make up time. So it sounds so silly, but I was in a completely calm state before I did that. Prior to that, I would have made such a mess of the poor dentist. I was wiggling because I was trying to get away, and I'm trying to tell them hurry up. They wouldn't have finished what they had to do. I would have been in pain, and I would have had a terrible meeting because I was so anxious. And it's happened to me before. I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but your brain just fogs up when you're in a state of anxiety and so on. I had clarity of mind. I walked in, I laughed, I told them about the neurocycle, and it was no problem. They were having a great time anyway. They didn't mind a few minutes, but I had made a huge deal. So there's an example of a day-to-day in my own life.
I love that. Do you bring in like cognitive behavioral therapy at all? Like, what are your thoughts about like the idea of cognitive distortions? It seems relevant.
Definitely, I say it with caution, because I think that everything that's been developed is of value. So every system that people have developed, there's good and bad in each one. I have an issue with CBT in that if you've got a toxic issue or an intrusive thought, and it involves all those cognitive distortions. Well, I love all those descriptions. It's great. But if you have all of that, which is reality, and you just try and say, okay, well, that's all bad, and I need to think of something new, it creates the white bear effect. That whole research, that what you don't want to think about, you're going to think about more. So what CBT does really well is that it will bring in some techniques that will help you temporarily band-aid the situation. So it's because the research shows that CBT is not yes, it's evidence-based. Yes, it's part of the gold standard treatment, but it's not actually as successful as people think it is. If you look at the evidence and the research, it's very questionable in terms of sustainability. So where it does work, and I've tested this out, is it's a great way. The Neurocycle is 5 steps. The 5th step is called an active reach, and that's where you do something based on a reconstruction process. So the 5 steps of the Neurocycle are embracing, processing, and reconceptualizing through a very systematic process over time. It's a reconstruction process where you accept, I can't change what's happened to me, but I can change what it looks like inside my brain, body, and mind, and change how it plays out into the future. So that's the kind of philosophical component. So if I've done those 4 steps of doing the deconstruction, I'm not saying don't be messy, that's a bad emotion, you want to get rid of that. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that's okay. You can be messy. Remember this where we started the conversation. But now, in order for me to cope where I am right at this moment, in today's day 1 of 63 or day 5 of 63 or wherever you are, what do I need now? And that's where I found CBT techniques to be very useful as a little exercise that I can do during the course of my day. Because you take your active reach, and your active reach is how you almost discipline your mind to not allow yourself to go back to the if only rumination or something. It's okay, I was doing that, but I'm going to do this to manage that. So there it works really well, along with things like positive affirmations. But they go to step 5. You use them earlier, you're not going to get the same sustainability and behavioral change or life change that people are looking for.
Thank you. I appreciate that, contextualizing it within your overall framework. I'm a huge nerd. I really enjoyed reading about your geodesic learning theory. I like the theory. Unfortunately, we can't cover everything today, but, people listening to this conversation, I'm sure, are very curious how they can dive deeper into your 5 steps and help them in their own lives. Could you just tell people a little bit where they can go to find out more about you and your work?
Absolutely. And Scott, that's really where you and I have a lot in common. We love our nerdy science. I mean, that's why I loved your book so much and your work.
Yes.
I love it. So yeah, the geodesic is just basically the foundational theory that this is built on, and these simple explanations in my book. I think the easiest...
loved reading about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm doing more research on it and updating it all the time. Basically, my Instagram handle is Dr. Caroline Leaf. That's always a good place because from Instagram you can get everywhere. I'm on TikTok. I'm on Facebook. I'm on all the social media platforms. My webpage, drleaf.com. And I have an app called the Neurocycle app, which is basically walks you through the whole process. There's the books and so on. So that's where they can find me.
You're doing a lot. Thank you, Dr. Leaf, so much for being on the show. And yeah, you're doing a lot, not just research, but doing a lot of changing people's lives. I'm sure you get lots of messages from people who thank you for changing their lives. So that should make you feel very good.
It certainly motivates me to carry on. It's when you see that happening, it's very, very encouraging. So I'm so happy to help people.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being on my podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.